On Saturday, May 14th, 2016, Canadian comic book creator and multiple Eisner Award-winning legend Darwyn Cooke passed away at the age of 53 after a battle with cancer. Cooke was, in my opinion, the greatest comic book artist of all time, and when I talk comics with a friend or a new acquaintance, I find myself bringing him up every time. Cooke's work struck a nerve with me instantaneously, resulting in a profound impact at just the right time in my development, the same way Christopher Nolan's Inception or Queen's album A Night at the Opera did. So when Captain Logan graciously reached out to me to contribute to Geekvolution's series of videos in tribute of the late Mr. Cooke, I racked my brain for a good couple of seconds trying to figure out what exactly to review. Do I review his masterful Golden Age, Silver Age opus DC The New Frontier? No, too big and it would take too long to make. I'm already 2.5 weeks late on this video as it is. Or do I try something I've never read before and review his first foray into the comics medium with Batman Ego? No, as far as I can tell it's out of print. I couldn't get my hands on it, and besides it's Batman, so I figured Steve was all over that. Guess I was wrong on that assumption. But then I thought to what drew my eye to Cooke in the first place, and my love of his work all stemmed from Before Watchmen, Minutemen. Before Watchmen was a controversial 2012 project DC Comics put together consisting of 7 core miniseries acting as official prequels to the landmark achievement that was Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, as well as a backup story pirate comic running through each issue. Eventually a one-shot was added and a 2-parter popped up, but that was after any and all enthusiasm in this project from the fans had left. The 7 stories were each focused on one of the 6 crime busters from the original, those being Silk Spectre, Night Owl, Comedian, Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, and Ozymandias, in either a 6-issue or 4-issue mini leading up to the events of the original Watchmen, as well as a 6-issue miniseries about the team of heroes from the 1940s whom preceded the second generation of masked adventurers depicted in the events of the original Watchmen, the Minutemen. Before Watchmen was a controversial event for obvious reasons. Watchmen is not just a masterpiece of sequential storytelling, but it's changed the industry and changed how the public viewed the medium. It was beloved by not only fans of comics, but of literature in general, and helped legitimize a format that was widely regarded as inferior for decades. It was what comics needed at just the right time. It was and remains important. So making not only a prequel, but a slew of prequels to such a beloved property after a lukewarmly received feature film adaptation of the original, and after DC had lost a lot of readers with its New 52 relaunch, seemed like a shameless cash grab to attract attention to a lot of fans. Maybe rightly so. Despite big and trusted names like Brian Azzarello, Len Wein, J. Michael Straczynski, Adam Hughes, Lee Bermejo, J.G. Jones, and Adam and Joe Kubert, among many others, the series never really resonated with readers, and fizzled out of the collective consciousness of fans everywhere after receiving underwhelming critical reception, and the numerous art delays certainly didn't help either. The Before Watchmen epilogue issue was quietly swept under the rug, and the whole affair has largely been forgotten about in the short 3 years since it ended. So it really is no surprise that Before Watchmen is largely ignored by fans of Darwyn Cooke, a gray blip on an otherwise shiny career. Besides, his 4th Parker adaptation even came out later that year, quickly deterring fans' attention. With all this pre-knowledge out of the way, I'll finally stop beating around the bush and get down to business. Is Before Watchmen Minutemen any good? Is it an underrated gem overlooked due to the stigma of being a Watchmen prequel, or is it a rightly forgotten, sleazy marketing ploy capitalizing on the Watchmen name? After rereading it, I can honestly say Before Watchmen Minutemen is a great story, fully deserving of your attention, especially if you're a fan of Darwyn Cooke or the history of the Watchmen world. Before Watchmen Minutemen, or The Minutemen, The Minute of Truth as it's titled in the book, tells the story of the Minutemen, from humble beginnings of their assembly and glory days to their implosion at the hand of personal demons and slow decline into irrelevance, chronicled through the 1940s, told from the perspective of Hollis Mason, the original Night Owl, in 1962 as he tries to navigate the legal red tape of publishing his memoir of the events under the hood. Serving as both writer and artist, Darwyn Cooke uses this premise to tell a layered story about identity and its relation to images, truth, perspective, and subjectivity, with characters barely touched on in Moore and Gibbons' original. And that's where I'll start. The characters. From the get-go, Cooke gives us a diverse lineup of masked adventurers, establishing distinct voices and fascinating character parallels. The first issue really just serves as a platform for introducing the 8 members of the Minutemen. Some get more attention than others, but we get a feel for each character to know their styles, and Hollis's relationship or distance with each one. Plus, seeing how our narrator is Hollis, this makes sense. Hollis's narration is also interesting, but we'll get to that later. In the meantime, there are a bunch of awesome character parallels at play here. We are first introduced to Hooded Justice. Hooded Justice is a man who is anonymous and mysterious, carrying out his own vigilante justice as brutally as he likes. No regard for police or due process, his anonymity gives his mystique a more symbolic meaning. He is the embodiment of justice, and if you've done wrong, justice is coming for you. Hollis, a policeman, repeatedly says about Hooded Justice, "He terrifies me," or terrifying, suggesting the proper authority on justice in the community is terrified by Hooded Justice because, as we'll see, they're corruptible. Justice is also theatrical, in a kind of Batman way, with a rope theme going on in his costume, and a torn noose around his neck, suggesting he is unbound. But, as we will later find out, he is a dominant in a BDSM relationship with Captain Metropolis. As his costume suggests he is unbound, he binds the leader, the lead authority, of the Minutemen in a sexual, personal manner behind closed doors. Next we have Silk Spectre. She uses her overt sexual nature not to fight crime, but to attract an audience and provide an illusion that she is fighting crime. Her face is seen and trusted by the public, but the only reason she's getting away with crime fighting is because it is all an act. Her agent, Larry Skeznator, is the one who sets up all kinds of facades, hiring actors to dress up as crooks and pretend to rob a jewelry shop that's in on the act for Sally to swoop in and save the day, but does so by paying off the police, the proper authority, giving the public a gilded image similar to that of the police. They're both smiling on the front page of the newspaper like another criminal is off the street, but both the police and Larry and Sally are doing this for financial gain in an unethical manner. While Sally and Larry are closely tied together in their introduction and throughout the story, there are things about Sally independently to compare to Hooded Justice, especially regarding the common theme of bondage. In our introduction to Silk Spectre thwarting a phony heist, we see her binding the so-called criminal. The public perceives her in a position of dominance, but the truth is she's bound to Larry, and Larry is submissive to the police. She's the antithesis of Hooded Justice. She's all theatrics, has her face seen, and is corruptible. So if Sally is the bottom of a hierarchy consisting of herself, Larry, and the police at the top, then Hollis is a member of the top of said hierarchy, but operates in a manner not unlike Hooded Justice, just with, less murders, and offers an interesting middle ground on the polar opposites that are Silk Spectre and Hooded Justice. But unlike Hooded Justice, we have the original Night Owl narrating the story, so we get a window into how he operates, being a cop to protect citizens, but also being a vigilante to actively fight those who mean to harm the citizens he protects while on the clock. Mason has his cake and eats it too when it comes to, no matter what, protect the innocent. And I like how Cooke writes Mason as somebody who's clearly self-aware of the contradiction he represents. You could argue Moore is really the one who gave Hollis this identity, and you'd be right. But I think Cooke fleshes out Hollis in such a human, humble, and optimistic way that's consistent with the brief characterization Moore gave him, but puts his own spin on him while he explores Mason's trials of trying to publish his book. If we're continuing this theme of bondage, then I'd say Hollis is bound to the truth. He's painfully honest to the reader at all times, even to when he confesses of murdering Hooded Justice on purpose towards the end. And anytime he experiences hardship or pain, you can't connect it to Hollis not being honest. The entire story is Hollis's confession and journey to being honest and tell the truth. Well, as we learn, the truth as he knows it. On the clear opposite end of the spectrum of Night Owl is Eddie Blake. When we meet the comedian, he's a selfish enforcer for himself. He doesn't care about what Hollis would classify as, quote, innocence, and I would argue only fights crime for some sort of alpha male dominance and self-gain. But when we meet him, he's just a kid in search of an identity. As the story progresses, we learn that he's somebody in need of a familial bond, whether that be with the Minutemen or the US government. Because of this lack of identity, Eddie possesses no real theatricality, only a violent temper he masks as such. While on the subject of theatricality, Dollar Bill is a literal theater character represented on the cinematic screen. Different from Sally, Bill is more of a reflection of how the public perceives the masked adventurers rather than a capitalist product meant to cash in on the fad. Sure, as a mascot for a bank, he is a capitalist product meant to cash in on the fad, but because he is bound to a brand and is a marketing tool, he represents the public's interest and excitement for the costume crime fighters, and his death marks the end of the public's interest in the Minutemen. Byron Lewis is introduced as rich and brilliant, and how the masked fad was made for Byron, and we're told that he's an inventor, especially in the field of aviation. When he makes his own mask in the Mothman suit, it takes him over and becomes his identity. Byron becomes consumed and bound by the new identity, and Byron the person becomes a shell who was eventually destroyed by substance abuse and alcoholism. The panel layout in Byron's introduction also does a marvelous job of setting up his increasingly deteriorating psyche. Silhouette is the only person whose identity and costume is the same as out. Ursula doesn't even really wear a costume and has a sort of freedom as a result, allowing her to be the most pure good of the 8 and, as Sally puts it, the best of us, because she isn't bound by an image or symbol being placed on her by the public or by herself. She is, however, connected to her peers by a form of bondage. She is bound by her past and her guilt. Her actions are fueled by what happened to her sister in Nazi-occupied Poland, rescuing children from pornography and sex trafficking. Her sister was operated on, and she sees the victim she rescues as penance for the sister she couldn't save. The guilt of not being able to save Blanche fires in her to more religious areas when she fails to save a child who strongly resembles Blanche. We aren't told about Blanche at this point, but Ursula is shot and the bullet passes through her and into the heart of the anonymous ghost girl. This leads Ursula to a church where she feels God doesn't love her, and we can connect this to a religious guilt and isn't loved because of her being a lesbian. Finally, we have Captain Metropolis. Nelson Gardner was a Marine lieutenant who also worked as a military consultant and assumed the role of a crime buster after he retired. Clearly, Nelson is a fighter and one who cannot stop. Remember, this is the same guy who tried to assemble a second team in the mid-1960s. Nelson is bound to what he sees as his duty, similar to how Hollis is bound by the truth. Whether that being the leader of a team of crime fighters or just being the submissive in a BDSM relationship with Hooded Justice. It's his duty. Even when Hooded Justice is killed, Nelson gives him a soldier's funeral because it's his duty as a soldier and a lover because he feels it's right. Contrast this with Comedian, whose position is used to strong-arm others into submission because he's told it's right. I really love how Cooke incorporates Metropolis' character personality in the art. Nelson is a very minor character in this series, but in his introduction we see a telescope in his lookout as well as a statue of Atlas on the counter. Atlas is the Titan god of endurance and astronomy who holds up the sky in Greek mythology. I like how in these small details we can infer Nelson's passion for astronomy. And I like how we never have an obligatory, I can relate this to Greek astronomy and mythology quip to awkwardly give Metropolis a quirk. We need more artists and writers who approach their material with this level of subtlety. Now that we have all the characters out of the way, I'm gonna move into some story, and by extension unpack Hollis Mason. The opening page's narration explains how our line of sight is limited, and while it expands over time, we'll never know or understand everything there is to know or understand about life and its mysteries. But in order to find some kind of happiness, we have to make peace with that. I should also mention Cooke visually represents this brilliantly. And the motif of circles at the center of panels definitely becomes an important thing in this story. Hollis is a person who grew up in the Midwest, referring to himself as a hick on multiple occasions, who is still caught up in the spectacle of living in a big city, and the masked adventurers are a natural extension of that fascination. Hollis's view is widened from the Midwest to New York City, and Hollis's intentions of this whole story, the point of the story to the audience, is to explain his awareness of the world in continuously widening view throughout, seeing more of it as a masked hero. This is brilliantly and heartbreakingly brought back to the surface at the end, when it's revealed that Hooded Justice had nothing to do with the disappearance and murder of the children, and it was all a setup by the comedian for Hollis to lead him to the real Hooded Justice, and Hollis ends up killing an innocent man. The truth, as Hollis has seen it, is the kind of narrow point of view he, now ignorantly, talked about at the start. The truth can be as subjective as our limited perspectives. As Hollis is unaware of the actual truth regarding his investigation of the children, so too is the public to the intentions of the Minutemen. The team really only exists for the sake of a brand and publicity, but the public reflects its perceptions of the Minutemen back onto them in the form of media. As a continuation of Dollar Bill being a reflection for the public's interest and excitement in superheroes, in-comic Minutemen comics become a thing. The public idolizing and reflecting their perceptions of the Minutemen into media. This provides an interesting theme of identity and how it relates to the characters of the team. Hollis in particular responds to this, confronted by an image of himself he feels he needs to live up to, because if he's not, then the public is being lied to, and it's his duty to uphold the truth. We can definitely tell this takes a toll on Hollis, as panels of the in-comic Minutemen comics are inserted into scenes of conflict and moral ambiguity. The public's image of the comedian, for example, is wrong, and that's my guess as to why Hollis is so against forgiving Eddie. Not only did he attempt to rape a woman, but notice he's reading a Minutemen comic at the beginning of the scene. Eddie is also betraying his civil duty as a member of the Minutemen by attempting an immoral act, something Hollis was probably raised not to tolerate considering his, I assume, conservative Midwestern upbringing. But before Eddie leaves the group, he lets his team know they're not what they're presenting themselves as to the public either. Only he, at least, knows he's aware of his hypocrisy. Hollis is a cop who is betraying his code to be a vigilante, while Hood and Captain Metropolis are secretly gay, lying to a public who doesn't approve of this kind of relationship. So, like the original Watchmen, Edward Blake is a morally reprehensible dirtbag, but he does have a point. One of the conceits woven into Watchmen is what it'd be like if actual costume crime fighters appeared in the real world around the same time as superheroes appeared in comics. So I love the idea of seeing Golden Age depictions of our heroes juxtaposed with their real world counterparts. I'd be far from the first person to tell you it's a common thought that superheroes are the Greek gods of the modern day in culture, but that's just what the public seemingly sees the Minutemen as. Godlike. Not in power, but in morality, and in 1962 it's an image Larry and the others are hell-bent on keeping, but the public of the 1940s hero worship of the Minutemen is misplaced. The only person who isn't guilty of this sort of public hypocrisy, who is as moral as the public sees her, is Silhouette, which is ironic because of her inner guilt regarding what she sees as religious impurity and her sister. What a fascinating character, made only more fascinating in how Cooke reveals this detail to us with this page. Ursula has nearly sacrificed herself in an attempt to rescue a little girl from a life of child pornography, and has undergone a sort of baptism from her nurse and lover, and is resting. The page is a 9-panel grid of an aerial shot of the master bathroom and bedroom, and the circular panel of the public's depiction of Silhouette is placed in lieu of the center panel, providing the illusion of a cross as the panel layout of the page. Brilliant. Simply brilliant. While all of this is present predominantly in issue 3, I love how this comes back around in issue 5 with Bluecoat and Scout. If comics were used as a tool of reflecting the Minutemen to Hollis, then now Hollis sees comics being used as a tool of inspiration for the public. Seeing both sides of this dynamic is great, because in a cynical world like Watchmen's, Cooke still manages to find the optimism in the moral exemplary of comic book heroes. Followed by breaking your heart. Cleverly integrated into the background and corners of panels are comic book issues of a series called Bluecoat and Scout, the same way we see Minutemen comics. We spend this story with the Minutemen from the beginning, but in the 5th issue, we're introduced to characters called Bluecoat and Scout that exist in the same plane of existence as Hollis, Nelson, Byron, and everyone else. However, unlike the Minutemen, Bluecoat and Scout weren't the inspiration for a comic series, they were two Japanese Americans inspired by the comic series. The Minutemen, as a unit, were assembled for predominantly monetary and publicity reasons, selling an image of morality and ideals. While that may sound like an extremely cynical business practice, Cooke takes this moment to promote optimism in the wake of cynicism. Yes, the Minutemen were assembled for predominantly monetary and publicity purposes, but it was also effective in fighting crime and threats, with most of its team wanting to fight because of it being the right thing. There are shades of gray. The anonymous Japanese-American father and son believed in the principles the Minutemen promoted. Why else would they come to the Minutemen in the first place? And the Minutemen did help because they knew it was the right thing to do, both morally and for their brand. I really like that Bluecoat and Scout aren't given an identity. There's Bluecoat and Scout to the Minutemen, and the reader by extension, the same way Hollis, Nelson, and Byron are simply Night Owl, Captain Metropolis, and Mothman to them. The same way Hooded Justice is simply Hooded Justice. They have become symbols and embodiments of whatever morals and ideals they promote in the eyes of whoever sees them. While Cooke promotes optimism, I like how he never forgets the capacity of evil and injustice in the world. Good may have won the battle, but the war between good and evil is never ending. Scout saved New York, but the public will never know. The gilded image of the Minutemen's moral absolution is promoted, but those who acted on and embodied the morality sold to the public are hidden and silenced. Tying this all back into the common theme of truth, Hollis lies to the boy dying of radiation poisoning, telling him the whole world is proud and that Scout is a recognized hero. As Scout can see, this is the truth. The government covers up the incident at the Statue of Liberty by lying to the public. And as far as the general public can see, this is the truth. It's fascinating to analyze the contradiction Hollis represents. Not only a cop who breaks the law to fight crime as a vigilante, but as somebody who's angry about and knows the truth about the government's lie to cover up the incident, whilst lying to the one who saved the city about the people's celebration of his actions. Telling Scout what he needs to hear. Perhaps more perspective could shine light on the government telling the public what it needs to hear, but we have to remember, this is about Hollis's limited line of sight, the truth as he sees it. As I wrap up discussing Cooke's writing, I want to talk about his voice for Hollis and the narration as a whole. His diction and word choice for Hollis creates a specific voice and a refreshingly old-fashioned lens to view our story from. I don't need a specifically colored box to know it's Hollis. I can just tell by the words and the unshakable voice I hear through those words. I also can't help but feel like Cooke is using Hollis as a POV character when it comes to writing. Cooke was a storyteller, but an artist before he was a writer. So the brief moments of this book focusing on Hollis as a writer do feel like Cooke coming to terms with himself as a writer, like the crystallizing thoughts analogy, and even with the opening being a meta-commentary of Cooke basically telling the audience this won't be as good as the original Watchmen, but he's trying his best. It's no Tolstoy, he says. These elements are human and add a tenderness to the overall reading experience. Okay, so I've been talking aggressively about what's being presented in the writing, but I'm going to take some time to talk about the art, because for my money, Darwyn Cooke was the greatest comic book artist of all time, and Before Watchmen Minutemen is no exception. Aesthetically, Darwyn's pencils are uniformly perfect with the rest of his work. His art has a sense of realism to ground his cartoonist sensibilities to the grim world of Watchmen, but he also uses those same cartoonist sensibilities to expressively display motion and action in a way that doesn't contradict what's already been established. Take, for example, Eddie in one swing knocking over a jar of eggs and smacking the bartender on the jaw with his bat. Or take the opening of issue 5 with Hollis talking about tickling the dragon's tail, and the image changing from a staircase to a tail to a clock. This isn't particularly realistic in our world, and it's a stretch for the world of Watchmen, but thanks to Cooke's ability to know how expressive to go, it doesn't take the reader out of the reading experience. Also, all the usual trappings are there. Proportions are never an issue, every character is unique enough in appearance, and his ability to draw the same characters at different ages in not only faces but physiques is commendable. Backgrounds are wonderfully detailed, and in action scenes I never feel lost in either where and how he places his characters, or in the geography of the setting. But I also love how Cooke knows when not to use backgrounds for some panels, knowing just when to focus on a character's emotions. Never does it feel like Cooke is cutting corners to make a deadline. Phil Noto's colors are also excellent in vibrantly capturing the expressive art in characters, as well as the muted tone of Hollis's memories. But what sets the art over the edge into brilliance is how Cooke visually conveys the themes and ideas. Like I alluded to earlier, Cooke integrates a visual motif of circles, and circles presented in each chapter help underscore the theme of each issue. The first is about perspective, Hollis's specifically, the truth as he sees it. The second is about danger, the threat underneath the pizzazz. Each of the 4 circles pinning down a different threat in Hollis's life, from his book, a bullet, and Larry wanting him to stop his book from publication. The third is different than the others, as the circles are scattered throughout the pages rather than being confined to one, and they're all about identity, which I've discussed extensively already. The 4th issue uses the circles to mimic a sunset signifying survival. The survival of Ursula through her evidence, the world's survival of war, and the survival of lost sanity prelude a chapter where these images provide a window into what these images mean to the characters who belong to these stories. The 5th chapter is about time, the shortage of time, what people do at the last minute, and what happens when time runs out. This issue is where the Minutemen officially break up after their last mission together in a last-minute effort to reclaim their former glory. The final issue uses the circle motif twice in reversal. On the first page, it's a close-up of a vinyl record of The Ride of the Valkyries, while Hollis informs the reader that it's the saddest music of his life in case they've never read the white pages of Under the Hood in Watchmen. The rest of the issue proceeds to rip your heart out of your chest and repeatedly beat it to the ground and stomp on it. It's so depressing in all the right ways. Like the first 10 minutes of Up! The story ends on the traditional 4-panel layout with the centered circle, this time with each circle representing a smiley face. While you could read into the parallels of Comedian's Pin from the original, I like to read it as an optimistic ending in contrast to how the final chapter begins, and it perfectly sums up and calls back to Hollis's worldview and the first page. He's learned that he's wrong about a person he killed, and living a life of ignorance for years, but he makes peace with that limited line of sight. He's strong and learns to survive it. He chooses to be happy in spite of the blood on his hands. But wait, there's more! Cooke's art also gives us insight into his characters. Take, for example, Eddie Blake. He's a violent juvenile delinquent who's loud and selfish, but in his introduction there's a panel of quiet honesty as his face is mostly in silhouette, as if in confession. This comes back one more time in the 2nd chapter, where Eddie admits his wrongdoing about Sally and how the Minutemen is the only thing he has. This also comes up with Hollis, and is also pretty relevant to the religious themes regarding silhouette. The other big character thing Cooke does with the art is silhouette. In her introduction, she's jumping out of the panels, and in the 2nd issue, her word balloons connect over panels twice. Ursula is the only character who was given this creative decision until Dr. Manhattan's appearance, though he is confined behind the panels while his abilities are the ones breaking the borders. She's elevated on a moral level above her peers, and is almost superhuman to the reader, on a very meta level, in her ability to travel beyond the panel's border. This is a small but awesome choice, and only adds to her title as Avenging Angel at the end of the 3rd chapter. Contrast this with Mothman, who was introduced right before her, and everything in his introduction is one image spliced into multiple panels, perfectly reflecting his fractured psyche. He follows her and loves her because of what she possesses that he does not. Speaking of single images that are broken into multiple panels, Cooke does this a lot in this story. It's cinematic, effective storytelling while also reading and looking like the original Watchmen's 9-panel grid. The final 5 pages of the 2nd issue are nothing but this, and it is suspenseful storytelling, the likes of which I haven't seen in a long time. This happens earlier in the 2nd issue too, where the Minutemen leave their first press conference and the image is broken into 3 panels. One which contains Larry, Sally, and Hooded Justice holding her arm, one which only contains Captain Metropolis at the podium, and one which contains Hollis, Byron, and Ursula. The commercial side, the face of the group and midpoint of the spectrum, and the people there for the sole purpose of doing good. The comedian not being here and Hooded Justice getting cozy with Sally is also some clever foreshadow for comedian imitating Hooded Justice at the end too. The next 3 panels are a single image broken into 3 as well, that being Hollis celebrating, and each panel's narration representing a different side of his feelings toward the Minutemen's actions, and these panels correspond to the 3 panels above them. And yes, this kind of stuff is happening all the time. One last thing regarding the art is something I'm not sure is intentional, but it caught my eye, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. I think Cooke integrates a double M into costume design and settings as a symbol or bad omen, something doomed to fail. I only noticed it on Mothman's chest, symbolizing his initials, Night Owl's cowl, and on the backs of the chairs at the Minutemen's meeting. Mothman lost his sanity, Night Owl accidentally murdered an innocent, compromising his morals, and the Minutemen died with a bunch of sins. Again, I'm not sure this was intentional, but it was something I noticed. So as you can already tell, I love this series. But it isn't without its faults. While the third issue is probably the best issue on a thematic level, its narrative flow is undercut by a bizarre non-linear storytelling choice that breaks the pacing in a confusing, jarring way. There are a couple coloring errors, especially on the color of eyes, but nothing too major though, and at times it does feel like pages go by of Hollis just expositing history without much happening in front of us. But I really like how jam-packed each page of this book is without feeling overstuffed. Every panel can breathe, and the art never feels choked, and this is why I love Cooke as a creator so much. He isn't coming up with cool things to draw for the sake of wanting to draw something cool. He's a storyteller trying to tell a story in the best possible way. This is also a very well-structured book, with each chapter reading like an episode of a miniseries. Everything you get from the original Watchmen and the under-the-hood segments from the original Watchmen is briefly brushed over and happens between issues, letting Cooke be able to tell his own story without being confined by the past. I can also see myself having discussions on what the best issue is. The final chapter brings everything together in a perfect way and is the greatest. The third chapter probably the most thematically engaging, but the second chapter might be my favorite, if because of how well Cooke tells the story of the Minutemen's glory days. The fourth issue is also great because of it being a series of stories told by the Minutemen, with Ursula's burial being the framing device, in a way that's totally different but also an effective homage to the second chapter of Watchmen. And I could totally understand why that'd be somebody's favorite issue. Of course, I can't have that discussion with anybody because nobody's read this book because of the stigma of it being a Watchmen prequel. In the end, Before Watchmen, Minutemen is a great piece of sequential storytelling and a wonderful prequel to the original. In some places, I think it's actually better, but surprisingly ambitious on a relatively small scale. If there's one thing I've heard people describe Darwyn Cooke's work as, it's that it's sexy, for lack of a better term. Kind of. His old-fashioned style evokes that of the 1960s, but this really isn't like his other works. It's more sad, somber, and heartbreaking, with a sobering, simple central character who refuses to give up his optimistic, altruistic personality. If you'd like more traditional Darwyn Cooke in the Watchmen verse, then I'd recommend checking out Silk Spectre, which he co-wrote with artist Amanda Connor, which coincidentally enough is collected with Minutemen. It's not as dense or brilliant as Minutemen, but Silk Spectre is still a blast and a joy to read with a great mother-daughter dynamic at its heart. On a story level, I'm giving Minutemen an 8 out of 10, and on an art level, it's a perfect 10 out of 10, making my final score of Before Watchmen Minutemen a 9 out of 10. It's really sad this was the final story Darwyn Cooke gave us at DC Comics, and since this is, it was a great gift to say goodbye.